July 4, 2017. Convicted terrorist Omar Khadr is set to receive more than $10 million from the Canadian taxpayer, a source familiar with the agreement said Tuesday. Justin Trudeau's Liberal government is also going to apologize to the former Guantanamo Bay detainee who pleaded guilty to 5 war crimes before a military commission in 2010, related to alleged offenses that occurred in Afghanistan in 2002, including the murder of a U.S. soldier. The Toronto-born Khadr, 30, had sued the federal government for $20 million for breaching his rights.
Former Guantanamo Bay inmate Omar Khadr say it's time for the government to apologize to their client and settle a $20 million lawsuit. Now, they argue the government failed to recognize international law and actually colluded with the U.S. to have Khadr imprisoned. One of those lawyers is John Phillips, and he joins me now. John, nice to see you.
Morning.
All right, $20 million, that's a big number. Can you tell us some of what your client endured during his time in Guantanamo?
He, and this was admitted by Canada in their defense, suffered sleep deprivation at the U.S.'s hands. They called it the frequent flyer program. Every 3 hours he was moved from cell to cell so that he'd never have proper sleep for 21 days before we had representatives attend to interrogate him. The agreement that was made in advance was that all of those interrogations would be shared with the U.S. and they would be able to use it within their proceedings against Omar, at which time, when these were taking place, he was still facing potentially the death penalty. So
yeah, it was not only sleep deprivation, though. He was like physically abused in there, is that correct?
He was physically abused. The solitary confinement, we've had plenty of issues of this in Ontario. He suffered under solitary confinement for huge lengths of time, was chained to cold cells. Dennis Edney has elaborated in detail, my co-counsel, when he was down in Guantanamo visiting him, just the horrible conditions that the kid was living in. And when he got in there, he was 15.
All right. Well, reports show the Canadian officials knew of these, what they're calling enhanced interrogation techniques. Others might refer to them as torture, and they did nothing. In fact, they told the public that Omar Khadr was being treated humanely?
That's correct. And we have our Prime Minister at the time, well, later, suggesting that what took place in the United States was due process as far as he was concerned, and that's just it's a shame that we have any cognition of what was going on down there.
Now, there are also no less than 3 separate rulings that our government improperly shared intelligence when it comes to your client.
That's correct. 2 at the Supreme Court of Canada level, making specific findings that there were charter breaches in relation to Omar. The response to which was simply to write a letter to the United States government saying, please don't use those interrogations in your proceedings. They proceeded to use them anyway. We didn't protest. We didn't take any steps to have him repatriated, and he was the last Western citizen held in Guantanamo Bay. Everyone else was released, and he was one of the only children that was there.
All right. Let me ask you how you would respond to critics that say if Omar Khadr was innocent, he should never have pled guilty in the first place back in 2010.
I would put it to you this way, Jeff. If you were in Guantanamo Bay suffering sleep deprivation, being chained to a cold floor, in solitary confinement, and someone came to you and said, here's your choices. You can stay indefinitely detained until the war on terror is over, or you can take a plea deal that will have you return to Canada, if Canada lets you, in a year and have an 8-year sentence. I don't know anybody in the world, frankly, with a few exceptions, who would say no to that deal, given the conditions of confinement that he suffered in Guantanamo.
Yeah. Others would ask why Canadian taxpayers should be on the hook to compensate your client for abuse at the hands of foreign authorities. What would you say to that?
Because we participated. We engaged ourselves in that process and never should have done that. And if you look at the Maharar decision, or the case that involved him, Canada paid in 2007 $10.5 million to deal with his claims arising out of incidents that took place in 2002 and 2003. Following that, we have an apology by Harper. We then have 2 Supreme Court of Canada decisions on Omar, saying that he'd had his charter rights violated, and Canada still did nothing, and in fact even delayed his repatriation to Canada.
Let me ask you in our final minute, in 2015, Justin Trudeau, he wasn't Prime Minister yet, but he said Omar Khadr deserved the protection of the Canadian legal system. How frustrated are you that now that he's Prime Minister, he has the authority to do something, but seemingly is unwilling to do anything about this?
So, and very quickly on this, Omar's just gone through a 19-hour operation dealing with injuries that he sustained in 2002 that remained untreated both in the U.S. and when he's in the Canadian penal system. He's now sitting in recovery with no income and no help from our government to get him through this. And I just want to add one other thing. This isn't just about compensating Omar. It's also sending a message to the Canadian government that we will not tolerate the treatment of our citizens the way Omar was.
Part of the $10.5 million will go to Khadr's legal team, while the apology will be delivered by the Justice and Public Safety Ministers, the source said. Khadr's lawyers and a spokesman for Public Safety Minister Ralph Goodale refused to comment publicly, citing confidentiality reasons. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, however, did not deny a deal had been reached. There is a judicial process underway that has been underway for a number of years now, Trudeau said in Dublin, Ireland, on Tuesday. We are anticipating, like I think a number of people are, that judicial process is coming to its conclusion. While Amnesty International welcomed news of the settlement, which another source said was signed last Wednesday, it has also sparked fierce criticism. The Canadian Taxpayers Federation, for example, started an online petition aimed at Trudeau, deploring the deal. Khadr's lawyers filed the $20 million wrongful imprisonment lawsuit, arguing the government violated international law by not protecting its own citizen and conspired with the U.S. in its abuse of the prisoner. The suit was, in part, based on a Supreme Court of Canada decision from 2010 that Canadian intelligence officials obtained evidence from Khadr under oppressive circumstances, such as sleep deprivation, during interrogations at Guantanamo Bay in 2003, and then shared that evidence with U.S. officials. A badly wounded 15-year-old Khadr was captured by U.S. troops following a firefight at a suspected al-Qaeda compound that resulted in the death of an American Special Forces soldier, U.S. Army SGT. Christopher Speer. Khadr was accused of throwing the grenade that killed Speer, but the evidence against him was flimsy. He pleaded guilty in 2010 to charges that included Speer's murder and was sentenced to for a further 8 years in custody. Khadr later said he only pleaded guilty to get out of Guantanamo. The youngest and last Western detainee held at the infamous U.S. military prison in Cuba returned to Canada in 2012 to serve the remainder of his sentence. He was finally released on bail in Edmonton in May 2015 pending an appeal of his guilty plea. After his release, he apologized to the families of the victims as he had done at his guilty plea. He also said he rejected violent jihad and wanted a fresh start to finish his education. Lately, he has said wanted to work as a nurse. Speer's widow and retired American Sergeant Lane Morris, who was blinded by a grenade at the Afghan compound where Khadr was captured, won a default $134.2 million in damages against Khadr in 2015, but Canadian experts called it highly unlikely the judgment could be enforced. A long-standing attempt to get the military commission conviction against Khadr overturned in the United States remains stalled. Earlier this year, the federal government apologized to 3 men to compensate them for the role Canadian officials played in their torture in Syria and Egypt. The apology to Khadr would follow similar lines, the source said.